I remember when I was 4 years old, I got lost in Disney World. Scared and confused a million miles away from home, I searched the pavilions until I finally found my saving grace. The real-life Peter Pan. I stayed with him for hours, playing with his shadow, listening to him make music, and even flying a little bit off the ground with the help of some pixie dust, until I was eventually reunited with my parents. A few years ago, I spoke with my dad about that one fateful day, to which he responded, "Erin, that is absolutely not what happened. This memory, as it turns out, is not a memory at all." There exists this huge misconception that memory is objective. That is, it's common for people to think that memories are like a tape recorder, and they play back exactly as they happened, which is simply not the case. Memory is reconstructive in nature, meaning it is not an exact replica of our past events, but instead is actively reconstructed by our minds. When we think back on a memory, our mind pieces together bits of information, but it doesn't get the whole picture. And this can lead to the formation of something called a false memory. Now, a false memory is a psychological phenomenon in which someone recalls something that did not happen, or in my case, recalls something differently from the way that it actually happened. But how did sweet, innocent 4-year-old me fall victim to such a phenomenon? Well, I invite all of you today to play detective with me for a minute and help me solve this puzzle of what exactly happened that day at Disney World and how I formed my false memory. So let's start out with what we know. These are my actual memories, or the bits of information that I recall accurately as they were experienced. Number 1, when I was 4 years old, I did go to Disney World. Number 2, when I was at Disney World, I did get lost and I did stay with Peter Pan. And number 3, this one's a little embarrassing to admit in front of this crowd, but when I was 4 years old, I was absolutely in love with Peter Pan. But this doesn't explain the whole memory. There are a couple components of my memory that, much to my love-struck heart's dismay, did not happen. And these include the events that happened while I was lost and the amount of time that I was lost for. So let's first consider the events that happened while I was lost. According to my memory, I was saved by the real-life Peter Pan. And during our time together, I listened to music, played with his shadow, and I even flew. Sound familiar? Well, it should. These events are major components of Disney's 1953 hit film, Peter Pan. But how did the events of this movie incorporate themselves into my memory? Well, a major component of false memories is imagination. And essentially what the research suggests here is that the sole act of imagining an event, no matter how bizarre that event may be, can lead to that event being falsely remembered. And becoming a lost child in Neverland, playing with Peter Pan and flying around with pixie dust, just like the characters in the movie, was a scenario that love-struck me imagined constantly. Now, realistically, we know I probably didn't fly that day, but as far as my memory is concerned, the sole act of imagining that event was enough to incorporate it into my memory. But this doesn't explain the amount of time that I remember being lost for. Now, according to my dad, I was lost for a couple minutes max, but I distinctly remember being lost for hours. And this can only be attributed to one thing: my mother. I would like to draw your attention to a Facebook post that my mom posted the very evening that I went missing. It says, "My brave Erin was lost in Disney World earlier today for hours. She must have been so scared being away from me for so long. Hashtag long time no see, hashtag Peter Pan." So as you can see, her story is a little different than my dad's. And the influence that my mom's perspective had on me can only be explained by one thing: the misinformation effect. Now, the misinformation effect is the psychological phenomenon in which information learned after an event incorporates itself into your original memory. Now, my mom's Facebook post was the first of many recounts of our trip in which, according to her, I was missing for hours. And hearing her tell this story to relative after relative, eventually this misinformation was incorporated into my memory, so that I no longer recalled being missing for minutes, but for hours. So with this information, we can now see where my false memory came from. While some of the pieces of information that my mind used to reconstruct this memory were accurate, others were grossly manipulated by things such as the misinformation effect and imagination. So this begs the question, what really happened that day at Disney World? Let's go back to the beginning. When I was 4 years old, I got lost in Disney World. Scared and confused a million miles away from home, I searched the pavilions until I finally found my saving grace: a guy dressed up as Peter Pan. I stayed with him for a couple of minutes, not saying a word because I had a huge crush on him and I was incredibly shy as a child, until my dad realized I wasn't behind him anymore and decided they should probably come back and get me. Not as exciting, is it? So, looking back, my false memory wasn't inherently harmful to me, but this isn't always the case with false memories, and they can have huge implications in real-life settings, especially within the judicial system and among eyewitness testimonies. And because of this, it's incredibly important that we as psychologists not only understand the mechanisms behind false memories, but the reconstructive nature of memory as a whole. So that concludes my talk. I appreciate everyone taking the time to listen to me today. And hopefully when you look back on my presentation, you remember just how much you enjoyed it. Thank you.